I want to ask you to imagine that you're all standing on the sidewalk and you're walking, you're chatting, and you start hearing some trumpet music and you don't know where it's coming from, and you look around until you realize that it's coming from the roof of the 11-story building that you're standing in front of. And you might wonder, who is this and why is he standing on the roof playing the trumpet? You might be surprised to find out that it's the superintendent, actually, of the building. And he's a 67-year-old man named Roscoe Jones. And he comes and stands at the edge of the roof with a broken heart and a missing finger. And he plays the trumpet in public for the first time in more than 50 years. Windows opened beneath him, and people looked around for the source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, mingled as it was with the sounds of street traffic and the machinery of urban dwellings. But because the air was dry, yesterday's cut through it more clearly than it otherwise would have. And by the time Roscoe was descending chromatically through the final melodic phrases G, F, C, D, E, and E, 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 there was an audience of 50 people at least, or 100, or maybe more. He held that last E as long as he could until his breath was nearly gone, and then his soul slammed back into his old body so hard it seemed to jostle him a little, and he became aware of the sound of clapping and even a few whistles, which grew louder but didn't displace the purity of that last E. A gentle wind off the lake picked up and lifted the hem of his untucked shirt. He closed his hand around his trumpet and held it against his belly. Then he looked out below and then beyond. There were people clapping, calling for an encore. He hadn't expected that. He searched the crowd for faces that he knew, but from such a distance, nobody was distinct. But then again, even up close, it was often hard to tell who people were. It would have been nice to recognize someone, he thought, as he prepared himself to bow. One someone in particular. It would have been really nice. But maybe it didn't matter. They were all just people living their lives, sharing an unforeseen moment, congregating on some distant future memory, and now they were clapping for him, as though they knew him, as though he were somebody worth knowing. Maybe he was, and maybe they were too. And it was that thought, along with the E still singing in his ears, that occupied his mind as he folded himself in a deep and grateful bow and fell. And thus begins the end of the life of Roscoe Jones. And Roscoe grew up in that 11-story building in which the novel takes place. His father was the superintendent before him, and he lived there with his mother. And he used to wander the streets of Chicago as a boy to escape his demanding father. And one evening, he found himself at the back door of a jazz club, and he had never heard jazz before. But he was so taken by this music and he was pressed with his ear under the window, and he met someone very special, the very famous trumpeter Clifford Brown, called Brownie. And Brownie saw him sitting out there, and he took pity on him and said, "Come on in." And he let him listen to their set from the Wings. And when they took a break, Roscoe snuck back to where they had left their instruments, and he picked up the trumpet and he started to play. And of course, it was terrible, as you can imagine. But Brownie was standing there, and he overheard him, and he had such a sweet demeanor, and he said, "Let me teach you a little bit about how to play." And he did, and he was so taken by Roscoe's earnestness that he actually gave him the blessing standard that Roscoe took home and learned to play, and in fact he became something of a prodigy. He practiced as much as he could, and he played his first concert when he was 15 years old. That was his first and his last concert, because shortly thereafter his father asked him to help repair a steel cage elevator door in the lobby of the building. And when he did so, he got his hand caught in the gate and severed his middle finger. And that was just the first of many losses. A couple of years later, his father died, and there went the dream of doing anything other than leading the life that he had known inside those 11 stories. And so he stepped into his father's role. He became the superintendent of the building. He took care of his mother. And for the next 5 decades, he lived alongside and in service to the tenants of the building. And he did learn to play the trumpet again. He learned how to compensate for that missing finger, but he had lost his confidence, and he never played outside of the building again, except for that October day where he climbed up to the roof and stood on the edge and played Yesterdays in the style of Miles Davis, which was his very favorite song, and fell. And so to the bystanders that were listening, what ensued was a linear descent with a very tragic ending. But to Roscoe, it was something altogether different. Time seemed to stand still for him, and his fall became a slow, almost drifting descent through a lifetime of memories. And what came up were experiences that he had in a very specific descending order, starting with the relationship that he had with the arrogant, award-winning author named Lenny Dreyfus, who lived in the penthouse apartment. Below Lenny was a woman named Sylvia Freeman, and she was a hoarder who became so after her husband died shortly after they moved into the building. And then further down was a family that Roscoe called the Busy Bees. It was a mother and father and their 4 children under the age of 7, all of whom were named something that began with the letter B. And it fell to Roscoe to help them contend with their constantly stopped-up toilet. And Roscoe continues to fall, and we encounter my very favorite story, my favorite tenant, who was Joaquin, an elderly Cuban lector. And if nobody knows what that is, in the first half of the last century, cigar factories employed readers to entertain the rollers while they worked these terribly long, arduous hours in the factories. And it was a very special job. And a lector would show up in a starched shirt and a hat and sit on a platform, and he would read from the literature of the day, and he would in effect educate the working class, which was all well and good until Castro decided that it wasn't. And so Joaquin spent 10 years in jail, and he had to leave the country that he loved so much, and arguably he lost as much as Roscoe did. And their friendship sort of knitted them together in a way and let them compensate for their losses. So he's continuing to fall, and the narrative shifts around the 4th floor inside the building. And we can see Roscoe passing the window, and we look at a despondent man named Herbert Dunn, who is descending into his own demise over an unrequited love. So Roscoe falls, and as he does, we learn so much more about him. And what's interesting to me about that is that it occurs to me that we are all like that. We can all look at our lives as a collection of stories. And those stories are most important when they revolve around the relationships with the people that they encounter. we get to know ourselves in the context of the relationships that we have, whether we know someone well or not, or like them or not, or love them from up close or from far away. These are the stories of our lives, and this is the story of Roscoe's lives through all of these relationships that he has. And I got the idea for Roscoe when my grandmother was living in a memory care facility, and my sister and I went to have lunch with her one day, and she was seated in the lunchroom with a table of people that she had befriended, and they were telling their stories, and they were animated, and these are people who had somewhat lost touch with reality, and they had visited the past, which is where they were most comfortable. And there was an elderly man who looked very statuesque. I could tell he was in a wheelchair, but he looked like he was probably very tall and strong, and he was very kind and quiet, and he said not a word, not one word. Everyone was talking around him and to him, and he didn't have anything to say. And I kept looking at him thinking, now here's a man who's lived at least 7 decades, and all of the stories that comprise his life are lost, even to him. And it made me think about all the people that I look around and look past and don't recognize all of the stories within them. And I got the idea to tell a story about someone named Roscoe and to imagine his life in relationship to the people that he knew.